Welcome, everybody. My name is Ahmed Shamsi, and I welcome all of you to another instance of a book talk at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome as the speaker or as the discussion partner, Aaron Rock Singer from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, who is going to speak to me about, or who I'm going to forcefully speak to about his new book, which is titled In the Shade of the Sunna, Salafi Piety in the 20th Century Middle East. The structure of our meeting is going to be that I'll invite Aaron to give a short and snappy kind of summary of his book, what he thinks the book is doing, what it is changing in the discussion of the topic, and then we're going to have a discussion. During the discussion, you can type up your questions or you can raise your hand, so that in the last part of our talk, we will of our discussion, we will in fact let you ask questions and engage with our author. So without much further ado, Aaron, please go ahead.
All right. Ahmed, thanks so much for having me, for being in discussion with me, for reading the book, for that matter. I'm very grateful. Also, thanks to Tom for having me, and to all of you for logging in today. Now, as you all likely know, because you're attending this talk, this is a book about Salafism, an Islamic reformist movement that originates in the Middle East and South Asia during the early 20th century. In Egypt, Salafism as a project arises with the establishment of Ansar as-Sunna al-Muhammadiyah in 1926, 2 years before the establishment in 1928 of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the conversation about Salafism usually centers on two distinct features: theology and law. On the theological front, Salafis share with their counterparts in the Wahhabi Hanbali tradition a commitment to a particular approach to God's names and attributes. On the legal front, they share a call to derive all law from the Quran and Sunna with fellow 20th century Islamic reformist movements, whether Islamist or Islamic modernist. And there's, of course, an overlap between those two categories sometimes. Now, the focus of this book is on neither theology nor law, or at least not theology or law in isolation, but on social practice. And my argument here is actually, if we want to understand Salafism's commitment to particular understandings of theology and law, we need to look at social practice, because social practice is precisely one of the key arenas in which that commitment plays out. Briefly speaking, these social practices are fourfold: praying in shoes, a practice that was very popular in the mid-20th century but has largely died out; gender segregation, a fist-length beard combined with a trim mustache; and shortened pants or robes to the ankle length. Now, none of these practices are exclusive to Salafis, but collectively, when Salafis perform all of them, they make Salafis recognizable as Salafis, both to other Salafis and to non-Salafis alike. And in a political context in which Salafis are a minority and in which they rarely have had access to the levers of power, practices that facilitate individual engagement and maintain communal boundaries are crucial. And this is why, over the course of the 20th century, Salafis have adopted these distinctive social practices. Now, before we get to the conversation with Ahmed, I'll just foreground the two key moves that this book makes. One is an empirical point. In a lot of the literature, and indeed in my understanding of Salafism before I started this project, I assumed that these practices were long-standing. I assumed that they proceeded logically from a particular interpretive approach and exclusive reliance on the Quran and the Sunnah, and that they were essentially self-explanatory. This is very much reflective of Salafism's self-understanding, but it also has analytically very much seeped into the academic literature. The second point here, beyond dating these practices far later than one might expect if one were to assume that they emerged directly from a particular interpretive approach, is to explore the internal logic of these practices. It's unequivocally the case that Salafis cite extensively from the Quran and Sunnah, particularly from the Sunna. the question is how to make sense of that practice of citation. Is citation a historically continuous act, or is it a radically discontinuous act? And my argument is that the citation of early Islamic sources by the Salafi movement as a movement that is fundamentally committed to continuity with this golden early Islamic moment blinds us to the significant discontinuities in logic that these practices represent. And by focusing on four practices, by exploring not merely their performance physically, but the logic that undergirds that performance, I tell a new story of Salafism. And to foreshadow a key part of my argument, I argue that one of the distinguishing factors of Salafism as a project, one that it shares with ideological competitors, whether Islamists or secular nationalists, is this assumption that there is a linkage between one's internal ethical state and one's external performance. That to be Salafi is not merely to dedicate oneself to God in a very specific way, not merely to dedicate oneself to emulating the model of the Prophet Muhammad in a very specific way, but to also be seen as doing so. And this model of this linkage between ethics and visibility is one that Salafism, like other 20th century social movements, Islamic and non-Islamic, has inherited from the modernizing Egyptian state and the projects of subject formation and self-regulation that it transmitted. So I'll wrap up there, and I really look forward to the conversation with Ahmed and also to your questions.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So there are, a couple of things that struck me about the book that I want to start with on the kind of very surface level of it. First of all, the cover has a rather striking image that kind of, I don't know, I find it rather disturbing. I mean, there's this person, it's not clear. I mean, I assume it's a woman. It could also be a Moroccan man, but I assume, and there's this hair exploding out of her face. Like, what does that mean? Is that meant to just cover her face, or why does she have this? This is looks like a werewolf, some sort of.
So okay, so we've got the cover right here. Yeah, kind of appeared. So this is supposed to be a scantily clad woman. It comes from the pamphlet, a 1980 pamphlet published by a leading Saudi Salafi scholar, Abdelaziz bin Baz, one of the major figures of the Salafi movement transnationally. Now, part of what's so striking about the original pamphlet, which was produced by a defunct Egyptian publishing house, is that it's one of the only Salafi pamphlets I've found that has such a vivid depiction, let alone a vivid depiction of a woman with a wine bottle, a glass of wine, and a deck of cards. And it comes from a pamphlet on the danger of a tabarruj, which historically has been translated as flaunting, women flaunting, and relates to a Quranic prohibition, not le tabarruj, not the flaunt. In this text, Ibn Baz, though, argues that a tabarruj means not individual female conduct, but rather any presence of women around men, any gender mixing, ikhtilat al-jinsayn. And he declares in this text, at-tabarruj ma'nahu al-ikhtilat, which is essentially a very novel interpretation of this prohibition, and one that he, in many respects, backs down from in the years that follow. Now, the reason I chose this image for the cover, though, is not merely that it's a striking image, though I hadn't really thought of the Moroccan angle, Ahmed, but because it so vividly and viscerally indexes Salafism's concern with visibility, that this is a really clearly articulated vision of the danger of what people can look like. That here we're thinking of visibility in both negative and positive terms. In a positive sense, one is indexing one's commitment to piety. In a negative sense, one is indexing one's commitment to impiety, to immorality. In both cases, though, the communicative power of the body is assumed. And this is a logic that is very much inherited from modernizing states in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Oh, interesting. The second point that struck me was the title. In the shade of the Sunnah, that's obviously a reference to Sayyid Qutb's famous tafsir of the Quran, fi dhilal al-Quran, in the shade of the Quran. So how does that, like, is that a term that you feel was taken from, I mean, so is that like an indigenous term that you found, or is it something that you've kind of just changed from Qutb's, discussion of the Quran to the Sunnah?
So you're absolutely right that the title is inspired by Qutb's Quranic commentary. And so thinking about it, one of the things I found most powerful normatively in terms of the title of Qutb's commentary is this image of being able to immerse oneself in the Quran. And I think that it's really important to understand the groups or thinkers that we study in terms that are at least partially recognizable to them. And so there, Qutb very much understood himself to be doing, by really immersing himself in the Quran, to be deriving everything in his thought from what he understood to be that pure source. Salafis have a similar self-understanding, but vis-a-vis the Sunnah. And so I thought it was important to have a title that really communicated that self-understanding. I was then informed later when someone said, I really appreciate the pun in your title, that this could also be a pun on In the Shade of the Sun, but I hadn't even considered that possibility when I chose the title.
So I have the overall, first of all, when I saw your book, I was first of all a little confused because I felt like I had just read your first book. So congratulations for being able to finish a second monograph in such a short time. But also, I was wondering, how do you see the connection between your two books? They both have they both focus on they both have a strong element of Egypt. They do talk about practice.
Yes.
Is the second one, like, is it a continuation of the first one? Is it like a particular chapter of the first one that you're expanding, or is it an idea that grew out of that? What is the relationship?
So it's an idea that grew out of it. So when I was writing my first book, I was looking at gender relations. I was specifically, when I was focusing on gender relations in 1970s Egypt, I came across this term of ikhtilat al-jinsayn, of gender mixing, as prohibited. And I was curious where it came from. And I assumed that Salafis had always practiced it. And so I went looking to figure out how long they had practiced it for. And this ended up leading me to go down a pretty chronologically broad rabbit hole, going back to the 1930s. And discovering, though, that Salafis only adopted gender segregation as a non-negotiable principle in the 1970s. And this led to an article published in 2016 in Islamic Law and Society titled The Salafi Mystique. And so my first book was focused on 1970s Egypt. And this project on Salafism was taking me much more clearly into 20th century Egypt more broadly. And also shifting me from focusing on a variety of movements who contributed to the rise of an Islamic revival in 1970s Egypt to a focus on a specific movement and how it developed over time. Now, one of the interesting things for me in doing this project is that in 1970s Egypt, the main group I focus on for this book, Ansar Sunna al-Muhammadiyah, actually play a pretty negligible role. They're really not that involved in the rise of the Sahwa Islamiyah. It's really, in terms of Islamic movements, it's really the Brotherhood and the Jama'iyah Shari'iyah that are much more involved. Ansar Sunna are much more junior partners, and in some sense they're disadvantaged they're working from a place of structural challenge because they really don't have the language to talk about religio-political contestation in the way that their counterparts in the Brotherhood and to a lesser extent the Jama'iyah Shari'iyah do. And so you're right that there is a continuity that links these two books in terms of my focus on practice. And here my question was not the broad practices that became normative in Egyptian society in the 70s, which was the focus of my first book, but rather how Salafism as a project emerges over the course of the 20th century, overlapping for a period of 10 years with the focus of my first book, but really from 1930 to 1990. And it's only by taking that roughly 60-year time frame that we can actually not merely trace when these practices emerge, and their emergence is relatively late. Many of them, with the exception of praying in shoes, emerged in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But really what we can do is not simply trace their emergence, but also the moments where those practices are not normative. Also the moments when, for example, there's a conversation about the necessity of facial hair, of a beard, and there's absolutely no discussion of the basic marker that would have ultimately become distinctive to the Salafi project, or canonical within the Salafi project, of the minimum of the qabda, the fist. And so part of what's so interesting here is not simply tracing the emergence of a given practice, but also tracing the changing logic by which those practices, broadly speaking, and their particular details came to be conceptualized.
Just on a very private, personal note, I'm half Egyptian, so I have a beard. So this constantly comes up. I remember like how this is also historically positioned. I mean, these days, having a beard is a general thing that people do.
Yeah.
When I grew my beard in the 90s, it was considered to be a very specific, like for my Egyptian relatives and friends, it was meant that they perceived it as like a political, religious statement. I remember the first time I went to Egypt with a beard, I was asked whether I had become a Sunni, right? Question. What the meaning of Sunni is, but that idea that that can change, and of course then once having a beard became fashionable, globally, it ceased to be. At least I was under the impression it ceased to be less of a political problem. But just now, like last week, I was in Egypt and I had my ID card renewed, and they were not happy that during Corona my beard had grown from my last picture, and I had to go like to a special office, and somebody had to interview me and sign a piece of paper. So there was a lot of headache just having a beard. So the kind of visibility, the way also the Egyptian government classifies people through the beard, right, is also is also a big issue, right?
Well, so you were struggling with challenges of miscommunication, just like Salafis, which is to say that you grew your beard for one reason, a lack of social pressure to be clean shaven, having a mask all the time, etc. And it made some people make a certain set of assumptions about you. And this is something that Salafis really struggles with too, particularly in the late 1980s, in the context of a spate of violence by jihadi groups, some of whom were Salafi jihadi, others of whom were not. And essentially, one of the real frustrations for Salafis was that they kept all the majority of whom were quiet, weren't even engaging in political criticism of the Mubarak government, let alone engaging in any kind of political violence. One of their deep frustrations was they kept getting rounded up because the security forces essentially assumed that everyone who had a bushy beard was a jihadi and should be rounded up. And so this was a key problem for them. And I mean, that's exactly what makes the multiple practices so important, that it's certainly possible that one could be perceived as, there could be an ambiguity as to whether one is a Salafi based on a beard alone. Though, in fairness, I would have looked at you and said he can't be a Salafi because he doesn't trim his mustache. Yeah. And because you're not quite, you have much more in some sense of an Ikhwan beard than a Salafi.
That's right. I think that's the problem right now. If I had a longer beard, then it would be less of a problem. It is too close to the Ikhwani beard that would be safe. Yeah.
But it's really it's a problem of communication. It happens because we have this overlap of fashion and piety when it comes to facial hair. I can think of another Islamic law academic who was in West Philadelphia and was basically saw a Salafi beard and asked a man, "Are you Salafi?" And he said, No, I'm not even Muslim. It became clear that this had actually become a fashion among African American men in West Philadelphia that had nothing to do with Islam, but the name of that beard was a Sunni beard. To come back to your naming challenges here. So there are these challenges of miscommunication, and they really get us at a key part of what it means to belong to any group, which is to be perceived as belonging to such a group. I also can provide something of a anecdote from some time I spent looking at Salafi message boards, where one of the challenges that some Salafis faced was an inability to grow facial hair. And because, these young men really wanted to fit the model. They really wanted to grow a beard that was a minimum of a kapta. They had less of an issue with a mustache. They really wanted to grow a beard that was minimum of a kapta, and they couldn't. And they kept being mistaken as not being Salafi as a result. And we're trying to figure out what in the world to do.
Yeah. On the question of methodology, I mean, your first book had the word practice in it. Now, I mean, you're using that as well now in your second book. You also use the even hotter term of embodiment. How do you think that? I mean, first of all, like, what kind of what other works that you've read do you feel like within the field of Middle Eastern studies or outside of it, do you find is useful on that specific question? And how does this approach kind of help you get beyond the more institutional poli-sci discussions of Salafism, or the more just strictly textual ones?
So this is a great question. In doing this work, I'm really benefiting from scholarship both on and beyond the Middle East on nationalism and gender, because both of those bodies of scholarship foreground the centrality of the body to competing ideological projects. And in some sense, by centering the body in the study of Salafism, by centering social practices performed by the body, I am essentially trying to give us the tools to think about Salafism in comparison to competing ideological projects that ostensibly have little to do with it, that Salafis certainly would not recognize as having anything to do with their project. Now, my argument about the centrality of practice is that if we were to study Salafism as a project of theology alone, it would be very hard to trace change over time. That Salafis will cite most prominently Ibn Taymiyyah in terms of their understanding of God's oneness, of Tawheed. And that's consistent. But what does it mean to lay claim to Tawheed in a Muslim majority country in the 20th century? What does that claim actually do? Now, we can think broadly and say, well, it's not merely a claim to monotheism. It's not even, to use a word that Cole Bunzel uses in his work, it's not merely a question of moving from belief to practice, to monolatry, to orienting all of life towards worship of God. It's also a challenge to state sovereignty. It's a challenge to projects of formal political control that lay very particular claims to the bodies of men and women, Salafi and non-Salafi. Now, the question then becomes, okay, so what is the broader significance of practice? How does practice help us tell a story of Salafism? What can it help us understand Salafi's commitment to theology and law? And I'd argue that it's essential to understanding Salafism's commitment to particular theological and legal approaches. And the reason for that is that it is through practice that Salafis live these ideas. It's through practice that they've lived these commitments. And it's similarly through practice that we can see beyond the self-understanding of Salafism as, for example, deriving all law from the Quran and Sunna. We can trace the process by which this legal approach functions in practice, or functions in, I'm going to use a different word than practice, functions on a granular level as these projects are developed, not merely as they're developed, but then as they're canonized as authoritative. And so what I do in terms of going beyond the existing literature is to tell a story of the way in which Salafism's theological and legal commitments are put into social reality. And then how that social reality shapes those theological and legal commitments in response.
That point is interesting, and it recurs in your book, which is the question of to what extent these discussions and these practices are historical versus ahistorical. Can you tell us something about, first of all, what you think the significance of this is, and how that, how does it contribute to telling a history of Salafism rather than just this unchanging phenomenon?
So here in thinking about Salafism's citation of the past and how to make sense of this citation of the past as a question of historical continuity or rupture, I actually am most inspired by scholarship in Jewish studies. And here I'm thinking of two works in particular. The first is a 1994 article in the Jewish Studies journal Tradition called Rupture and Reconstruction by Chaim Soloveitchik, who is a scholar of modern Judaism, but also the son of one of the two towering authorities of modern Orthodox Judaism in the United States, Joseph Soloveitchik. And what the younger Soloveitchik does in this article is to trace the development of models of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish piety in the 20th century, and to show that the legal prescriptions of those communities in the 20th century become more and more stringent, to the point that over 50 years, what the communal practice had been prior, what the leaders of that community had practiced prior, would be considered to be insufficiently stringent just half a decade later, or half a century later, excuse me. Now, the second work that I think with in thinking about the historicity of Salafism is a work by Muli Vidas on the Babylonian Talmud. And Vidas, so basically the Babylonian Talmud is set up with a series of opinions. And instead of seeing that series of opinions and dueling opinions as essentially being a chronological story, a diachronic story, Vidas pushes us to think of them as essentially a story of the author bringing a bunch of citations together at a very specific moment. And that the act of citation is not a historically continuous one, but rather a historically discontinuous one. And that we need to think of the context of the citation here, and we need to think about the Talmud not as a chronicle of a conversation over time, but as being the distillation of a conversation at a very specific time. And that's how I approach it. Those two works have been very helpful in thinking through how to approach Salafism, both the act of citation as not necessarily historically continuous, and also the act of reconstructing past practice as often involving really significant ruptures. So if we think about Salafism as a movement, one of the first things one notices is that Salafis seek to couch their claims to continuity with the 7th century through hadith citations. This is one of their, and the more hadith citations possible, the better. So for example, they lay claim to the practice of praying in shoes with narrations relating to Muhammad praying in shoes. Now, there's all the scholarship on the hadith corpus and assessing its veracity. That's not where I'm engaging here. Rather, I'm interested in the historical context in which, in the example of praying in shoes, this practice has largely died off for hundreds of years, really nearly 1,000 years when Salafis adopted, and they take it up again. And what it means to take a practice up again, why they take it up, who they're challenging in taking it up. And in the case of praying in shoes, it has at least two functions that have very little to do with the 7th century. Now, first, just as a contextual matter, there's a question of who you're competing with. In the 7th century, one of the key concerns of social practice for the early Muslim community is distinction from non-Muslims, whether people of the book or those outside of that criteria. In the 20th century, the question is distinction from other Muslims, particularly with the transition from colonial to post-colonial rule. And it's in this context that Salafis lay claim to a set of practices that initially distinguished Muslims from non-Muslims to distinguish them as a group of Muslims from other Muslims. And so here the function of these practices has totally changed. Yes, they still represent an effort to model oneself after Muhammad. That is historically continuous. But everything else in the story is different. And I think that the goal here, in questioning historical continuity between the 7th and 20th centuries, is not to suggest that Salafis are exceptional. They're not. They are concerned with authenticity in exactly the same way that other 20th century movements are concerned with authenticity, whether other Islamic movements or, for that matter, secular nationalists. I mean, if we think of movements concerned with authenticity and who tell histories of the past that are patently ahistorical in some respects, nationalists are at the very top of our list. But what I'm interested in is what that can tell us about Salafism as a movement, how that can help us think about Salafism comparatively, not merely comparatively within a given country with other movements, whether Islamic or non-Islamic, but also comparatively globally in terms of shifts of models of religiosity and how they shift over the 20th century.
I mean, this is very rich what you've said at the moment. So there are several ideas that I got from this. One of the questions I have, you mentioned the kind of a movement towards both, which you mentioned among Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, but also among Salafis, of becoming more stringent.
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent, as a conservative movement, the kind of the 20th century kind of automatically turns you more stringent, in the sense that when we look at kind of close social interactions between non-related men and women, it is the 60s really that in Egypt, of much of the Middle East, that really signals the beginning of women actually entering the workplace. And so it only becomes a question then. Before that, urban women generally don't work outside of the house. Peasant women do obviously do this on the field, whatever. But that's not that never really was such a concern among Salafis. In my experience, is really like the niqab only entered my Egyptian village. The first time I saw that, it was maybe 20 years ago. And it was considered to be very strange. And these were people who still lived in the village, but they didn't actually work as farmers anymore. But anyway, so what I want to say is that, in a sense, is it really new, or is it just you're bringing something to the forefront and make it part of discussions that was just a social reality before?
Well, so I think this is a really rich point, and let's tackle it with a question of female modesty and gender relations first, and then I want to move more broadly. It is certainly the case that in the 60s and 70s, more men and women are in shared spaces. There's no question about that. As you note, to increase education, bureaucratic employment, and so forth. What's interesting, though, is the Brotherhood is talking about the threat of gender mixing back in the 30s. They're concerned, and also the Jama'ah Sharia, they're concerned about its potentially deleterious effect on society well before Salafis are. Then the question then is, how do we make sense of the 70s as a point where Salafis go from valorizing a model of an individual pious woman who, by virtue of her individual conduct, can protect her chastity, can protect society, to being concerned with the broader social structures. And here, I think our explanation of structural changes in Egyptian society does a little bit less for us. Does it make it more urgent? Sure. But I'd say there are at least two other factors we need to consider. One is the state project of secular nationalist feminism, of state feminism, as Laura Beer puts it, in which women are objects and agents of transformation. And here, we're talking about the assumed communicative power of the woman's body that state feminism transmits to the Egyptian population over the course of the 50s and 60s. And Salafism responding to it, not by saying that women need to go back into the home, but rather by saying, yes, women's body has communicative power, we just need to use it differently. We need to communicate different things. The second thing I would say is that it's in the 70s that Salafis in Ansar Sunna in particular are competing or beginning to compete with other Islamic movements such as the Brotherhood or the Jama'ah Sharia, or for that matter, the Islamic student movement, the Jama'ah Islamiyah on Egyptian campuses. And this is a context in which, for the first time in really almost 2 decades, Islamic movements broadly have a chance to compete socially. This is Anwar Sadat comes to power in 70, and following the first few years of the Sadat presidency, things open up, particularly on university campuses. And so it's here that Salafis in Ansar Sunnah have to distinguish themselves from their ideological competitors, who are all offering particular understanding of gender relations. And I would argue that it's this context of competition among movements that explains more why gender segregation as a non-negotiable principle is formulated, rather than the contextual factor of women entering the educational and work spaces, though that factor absolutely contributes. I think that the broader focus on stringency has a lot to do with the spread of print. Here I'm drawing on Soloveitchik again, where we have the shift from mimesis, where one learns what it means to be pious, what it means to observe one's legal obligations by following those around you, by following your mom or your dad or your older siblings, to practice being transmitted, or going to the local mosque, to take it the Egyptian example, to a context where pamphlets on the stringencies of proper observance of a variety of matters are suddenly not only more accessible, but also literacy has risen, so they're reaching a broader swath of the population. And we then have the intersection of a third point, which is that law is considered to be a central form of legitimacy, that the modern state is making a variety of claims to regulating citizens' bodies, and so often in quite stringent ways. And so in some sense, the claims to not just stringency, but a certain univocality to law, a certain single meaning that can be followed, become not just increasingly plausible, but increasingly necessary in terms of competition, both with other movements and with the state.
Fascinating. And another aspect of that I find interesting is, so one of the points you mentioned in the book, and you've mentioned here already, is this idea of praying in shoes, which was you find in the early Hadith corpus, seems to have played a particular role in kind of communal self differentiation from other Abrahamic religions, particularly Jews. But there's also certain kind of randomness and kind of contingency in kind of why that came up, right? Because in a sense that there are, like in Saudi Arabia and in parts of Yemen, what some of the Salafis did was they adopted a different type of like very similar type of differentiating practice, which is dyeing white hair with henna, as the Sunnah. And again, that's something that was a big deal in early Islam, and then kind of ceased to be, but they kind of recovered that and made that a part of their identity. But as far as I can see, that it never caught on in Egypt. So you even have different traditions of Salafism in different areas that also, I guess, I don't know how it works when they meet, how they negotiate that, these varying kind of ways of doing this. But so what is do you see is there a logic to why specific people adopt specific kind of, resurrect specific kind of practices as differentiating themselves in different regions?
Well, so the example of praying in shoes is really rich in this respect, because it's not simply that there is evidence in the Hadith corpus that Muhammad prayed in shoes, but also that even as the practice of praying in shoes died out, it was actually preserved in the Hanbali tradition. So when Salafis from Egypt traveled to Saudi Arabia, they found people praying in shoes, and we're very happy to find people praying in shoes. For example, when the former Minister of Endowments, Abdul Mun'im Nimr, goes to Saudi Arabia in the 1950s, he tells the story of accompanying Muhammad bin Ibrahim, and essentially asking bin Ibrahim, why do seeing people praying in shoes and saying, why do you let people make your mosques filthy? What are you doing there? And so we have, in some sense, here we have an overlap between Wahhabi Hanbalis and Salafis in terms of praying in shoes. Now, why a given practice both catches on and falls away in a given country, that ends up being a very historically textured story. In the case of Egypt, which is really the focus of my book, I'll offer a couple of reasons why it catches on and a reason why it dies off. The two reasons why it catches on are, first and foremost, that this is a way of laying claim to ritual space. Salafis, by and large, don't control that many mosques at this point, and so they're necessarily needing to distinguish themselves within mosques more broadly. And this is, ritually speaking, a really easy way to distinguish yourself from other Muslims, to say, we're Salafis and we're here. Another point, though, comes back to this issue of hygiene that Nimr's concerns index. And what they're doing is making a claim to the laws of tahara, of ritual purity, over the laws of modern hygiene transmitted by a secular nationalist Egyptian state. They're saying, you might say these shoes are dirty, but in terms of ritual purity, they're no problem at all. And so are you going to tell us that the state has authority to say how we can pray based on purity laws that are external to the Islamic tradition? And so in that sense, it has this dual effect of both distinguishing Salafis from other Muslims and also challenging this state model. Now, why it dies off or falls away is in some sense as interesting, because in the early through mid-50s, praying in shoes is a key practice of Ansar Sunna, and then for about 4 decades, having gone through every single issue of Ansar Sunna's publications for over 40 years. Actually, a total of 60 years. They don't talk about this topic for 40 years. And then it comes back a bit in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, why did they stop talking about it? Well, for some of the same reasons. They stopped talking about it very shortly after Abdel Nasser cracks down on the Brotherhood in '54. A time when being conspicuously pious in Egyptian mosques is a really efficient way of getting oneself thrown in prison. And so we really see Salafism as a project of practice go underground in this context. That they really are not pursuing socially divisive social practices in the face of secular nationalist authoritarianism.
That is very fascinating, Aaron. We have now another 15 minutes left, and so at this point, I want to open up the floor for questions from the audience. If you want to, again, if you want to ask questions in writing, type them into the chat. If you want to raise your hand, raise your virtual hand or raise your actual hand, and I'll be calling on you. So the first question I've seen in the chat is by Danielle Whitman Abram, who says, a methodological question about categories of analysis. One, you seem to be talking about lived religion without using that category of lived religion. What does social practice as an analytical category in your work get at more effectively than lived religion does, that lived religion does not? And then second, I might be mistaken, but I do not recall you using the word patriarchy in your account of Salafi commitment to the principle of gender segregation. I'm curious about the omission. What might we lose or gain by narrating this history in terms of the history of patriarchy? And let me make explicit my subtending question. Are we replicating the submergence of patriarchy that is performed by the state when we as scholars do not explicitly analyze male-dominated and dominating practices without naming patriarchy as the overarching phenomenon, and doesn't that submerged assumption of patriarchy actually link such sub-state religious movements to the state itself?
So, great questions. I'll take the second one first. In the book, I actually use the term patriarchy. I talk about Salafism as a highly patriarchal movement. It is fundamentally a movement that places interpretive and social authority in the hands of men. And in linking Salafism as a project to not just competing social and religious movements, but also to the modern Egyptian state, to the state project of state feminism. Yes, that is absolutely part of the story. It's part of the story in the book. There's no, gender is an inescapable, gender and the power of particular groups over others, particularly the power of men over women here, and also, you know, the way in which women can also serve as agents of patriarchy is absolutely part of the story. And look at the other part of your question. I would say also that methodologically, this was one of the relative absence of women's voices in the Salafi movement was one of the real challenges of doing this project. That there are women who are prominent enough in Egyptian Salafism that they publish. Namat Sidki is perhaps the most prominent person, and she figures very prominently in the story of gender segregation. But it's absolutely the case that one of the challenges one faces source-wise here is in terms of sources by women. The other thing I would say about gender more broadly here is that I think one of the values to thinking about Salafi practice is to actually think about Salafism as a gendered project, not merely of femininity, but also of masculinity. That this is a project in which men are given particular responsibilities, in which they are held to account for sometimes very difficult shortfalls in upholding those models, even when those models are extremely difficult to uphold. And this is a story in which gender, far from being limited to the chapter on gender segregation, is one that is omnipresent more broadly in understandings of practice. Now, in terms of lived religion, I think there are certainly ways in which my approach is similar to lived religion. I'm not primarily in religious studies, so that's not really where I'm locating myself methodologically or theoretically. But I think that what I would say is what I very much appreciate about the lived religion approach, and you know, I happen to be married to someone who is trained in religious studies, and so it certainly has been a topic of conversation in our household. What I very much appreciate about the lived religion approach is this linkage between what people do and how texts are interpreted. That's really valuable. That it's a way of really getting at the relationship between prescribed observance and social life. But because this book is not primarily in religious studies, it certainly has certain ways in which it engages with the religious studies, but because it's not primarily in religious studies, that's simply not where I was theoretically.
Thank you. The next question by Professor Bashkin.
Hi. Okay. Hi. So thank you very much for this talk. I have questions that are a little bit follow-ups on what Ahmed was asking. So one is about the methodology. So I understand that the historical engagement has to do with citational practices, but and sort of perceptions of the Salafis themselves about time. But how do you position yourself against, you know, vis-a-vis, let's say, anthropologists to actually view how people practice things and legal scholars? Because, you know, historians do look at change over time, change in location, so how Syria is different from Egypt. And you do engage with Henri Louis Zial, but this is a movement that now is very different than the days of Rashid Rida and others. I wonder how this change over time is connected to your methodology. The second question is about hierarchies. So one would argue that labor segregation and labor issues have much more profound influence on the labor market, on women, on patriarchy than the question of, gazma, shoe, prayer, and things like that. So and I was initially when I saw the table of contents, I was like, oh, we and the shoe, but then I understand where you're going. But I was wondering how you chose your case studies. Is it because it's important to the Salafis themselves? Is it just because you can sort of do the back and forth with the Islamic text? Is it because the state, for example, has a much higher stake in women's segregation or its or the lack of it from the days of Nasser than the particular practices in the mosques. So you know what, I'll leave it to two. I have a million questions, but let's stay with these two. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for these questions. Now, methodologically, one might say that I am somewhat between what anthropologists of Islam are doing and what legal scholars are doing. Because if I were simply as straightforward a legal scholar, I would be telling us history of changing legal interpretation, and in some sense gesturing at social context to it, but not really foregrounding social context in my analysis. If I were an anthropologist, I would be focused on what people think about how they understand what they're doing fundamentally. And that's, we see this in the work of Saba Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkind, among others. The challenge for legal historians is that the focus is not on social context, so we don't get a sense of the extent to which the legal battle is playing out, not merely among scholars, but also between those scholars and their respective constituencies. Whereas the challenge in the anthropological literature, and I engage most explicitly and extensively with Mahmoud and Hirschkind here, but particularly with Mahmoud, because many of her field sites for her first book were actually Salafi mosques. They were affiliated with two Salafi groups, one Ansar Sunna and the other Jama'at Dawat al-Haq, which are both unequivocally Salafi. A third of the four was affiliated with the Jam'iyya Sharia, which has many Salafi elements within it. There we have a story of how people understand their continuity with the past, how they understand their practices. And I think that bringing that out and thinking about how those practices work in the self-understanding of these groups is really important. But it happens to be the case that, unsurprisingly, as with so many groups, the stories that people tell about their practices are often patently ahistorical. And so what I'm essentially seeking to do is bring those conversations together, to bring the methodology of a historian to some of the theoretical debates of the anthropology of Islam. So, for example, to go to the anthropology of Islam in particular, one of the key questions for Mahmoud, Hirschkind, and others, how piety works. And thinking about piety as a practice of moral cultivation that is achieved through practice. Now, a key assumption here is that practice is primarily internally oriented, that those who are interested in externally oriented practice tend to be Islamists, but that the women that Mahmoud studies in particular are seeking to form themselves with relatively little consideration of how it looks. And one of the things I show in this book in thinking about these four Salafi practices is that this linkage between ethics and visibility, which again, for the anthropology of Islam literature, broadly speaking, is something that Islamists do, is absolutely something that the groups to which many of the women whom Mahmoud studied and whom Hirschkind studied, and many of the men whom Hirschkind studied, is absolutely central to those groups. And so here I am, in some sense, using the tools of legal methodology, of legal history, tools of social and cultural history and intellectual history to engage in a set of theoretical conversations that go beyond history. Now, in terms of how I chose my cases, these emerge from the texts themselves. They're not case studies, but rather, though I understand how they might come off as that, but rather they are the four key distinctive practices of Egyptian Salafism that emerge between the 1930s and the 1990s. And while it's certainly the case, as Ahmed noted, that there can be local variations on Salafi practice, so these things might look a bit different if we were in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia or Yemen, for example, that broadly speaking, what I do in the book is to show how the practices that emerge in Egypt are not only emerging in Egypt, that these issues are also being debated in Saudi Arabia, they're being debated in Syria, they're being debated in Kuwait, in Yemen, and so forth. And so in that sense, I let the sources guide me. And then once I'd figured out what the practices that people were talking about post-1970, or for in the case of praying in shoes, post-1950, I said, where the heck did they come from? And ended up going very, very, very far down that rabbit hole.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. Before we move to the last question, just a short anecdote. I once witnessed a kind of Pakistani Salafi dressed down an Egyptian Salafi. So this Egyptian Salafi was wearing short pants, like over the ankle short. But the Indian Salafi pointed out that the pants were so tight that you could see the buttocks of this man. So it's a totally immoral dress. You can have it as short as you want, but it's too revealing in that side. So you should wear shawar qamis. That's the real sunnah to wear. Anyway.
And this is, can I just say something? And this is actually, as a position, this has very good basis in laws of modesty, and it's something that comes up broadly across movements of your dress, whatever that dress is, not improperly revealing your body.
Much, Aaron. It is now shortly after 1, and as our book talks are only meant to last for an hour, I'm going to close this now. I want to thank so much, Aaron, for taking the time to discuss your fascinating work with us, and for all of you to take the time rather than being on the beach. Although I don't know, maybe many of you are on the beach. That's why you don't have your cameras on. But anyway, for joining us today, and I hope to see you at forthcoming events of this type. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks for having me, Ahmed. And thanks to all of you for coming.